Hi, I'm Monica, and I'm a former educator. I'm also the founder of Reparations Ed. And through Reparations Ed, I support educators in advancing equity for Black students. I am back again because last video I talked about how Black students have lower academic achievement and more negative school experiences than their peers. I also kind of touched on school discipline, and I mentioned how Black students receive more exclusionary discipline, like out of school suspensions and expulsions, than other groups of students. So I want to dive in more to that conversation because when I was an elementary school teacher, I did not have the opportunity to look at discipline data broken down by demographic and to talk about what are we going to do about this. I didn't know that it was, basically a national crisis that we have this over disciplining of Black students, and not a lot's been done about it. So I want to start off by talking about national discipline data because the US Department of Education, they put out discipline reports in various different forms, but every year, essentially, there's a report. And every year, it's the same story. So they put out a report in 2023, and it was for the 2020-2021 school year. What the report shows is very predictable and familiar. It shows that Black boys and girls are overrepresented in suspensions and expulsions. And the situation is really dire for our Black boys. So listen to this. Black boys represented 8% of total K 12 student enrollment, but 15% of students who received one or more in school suspensions, 18% of those who received one or more out of school suspensions, and 18% of those who received expulsions. That's hugely disproportionate. For Black girls, it's a little bit better. They represent 7% of total K 12 enrollment. 8% of students, they represent 8% of students who received one or more in school suspensions, and 9% of students who received one or more out of school suspensions, and 8% of students who were expelled. So this is a problem. And that data trend is similar to what we see in school districts across the country, including in Dallas ISD, where I live. I live in Dallas, and Dallas ISD had similar discipline data. And a few years back, they actually eliminated out of school suspensions. And in place of out of school suspensions, they have what they call campus reset centers, where they send students, they're still in a learning environment, but they're away from their home school. And those have been slightly controversial. Maybe your school district has something like that. So, because I'm a critical thinker, I always like to ask why. And I'll ask you, why? Why are Black students overrepresented in exclusionary discipline data? Well, from the research I have done, the books that I have read, what I've come up with and what, researchers have come up with is that stereotypes and bias contribute to this disproportionate treatment in school discipline that Black students receive. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about implicit bias. It's something that we don't talk about a lot. You may have heard that term, maybe a buzz term that's been around for a while, but you didn't really apply it to your teaching. You didn't really know what it meant. We all have bias. But a bias is just typically something that you're for or against. So, like for example, my son, he has a bias towards the LA Lakers. He thinks they are the best basketball team and he doesn't care about any of the other teams. And he also has a bias towards LeBron James. He loves LeBron James. That's an explicit bias. He knows he has that bias and he'll tell you all about it. So that's something positive. It's something harmless, right? It's not necessarily a negative. People can have negative biases too. Like for me, I have a bias against red wine because it stains my teeth and I just don't like the taste of it. It gives me a headache, so I don't drink it. So that's kind of a negative bias. Well, implicit bias is different because implicit bias is bias that you don't know you even have. So recently, I completed a course from Harvard Online called Unpacking Implicit Bias. I highly recommend it. And I also read a book that was written by the person who ran the course, who taught the course. She also wrote a book, and it's called Blind Spot. I highly recommend it, and I'll link it in the resources. So, in that course, what I learned is that implicit bias is attitudes or associations that we hold in our minds that we are unaware of. So, where do these attitudes and associations come from? Well, they come from the media. They come from TV, advertisements, movies, social media, family beliefs. In America, we absorb anti-Black messaging all the time. And usually that anti-Black messaging associates Blackness with criminality or inferiority. So I'm going to be real with you guys, and I'm going to give you an example of my implicit bias. And this is another sports example because I love sports. So I was watching an NBA game. It was the Dallas Mavericks versus Oklahoma City Thunder, and it was being played in an arena in Oklahoma City. And as I was watching, I was noticing that, wow, the crowd looks really white. It was like 90% white. There were not a lot of Black or Hispanic or any people of color in the audience. And I was like, wow, well, kind of makes sense. We have the wealth gap. Who has the most wealth in the United States? White people. And NBA games aren't cheap. So, like, who can afford to go to NBA games? So, that's already swirling in my head. Then I was like, well, the NBA could, go out into the community and give away tickets to Black people, Hispanic people, in the community who maybe can't afford to go. And then my next thought was, no, that'll bring an element of crime to the arena. I was associating Black and Hispanic people with crime. Me, a person who teaches about anti racism, who talks about implicit bias, who reads and researches and knows better. That was my implicit bias talking. Because if you asked me, I'm very pro Black. I would never, think explicitly that Black people are criminals. But in that moment, that was the association. We also have an association between poor people and criminals, but that's a whole nother subject. Those mind bugs, as they've been called, that was the phrase used in the book that I read called Blind Spot. Those mind bugs are so insidious in all of our minds, especially growing up here in America where anti-Blackness is prevalent. We have all absorbed that messaging. And so, how that applies to you at school is when you are disciplining students. Do you give out harsher discipline to the Black students than the white students because of your implicit bias? Trust me, it does not make you a bad person. The goal for me here doing this video is to bring awareness and to help people become self-aware and to start reflecting and to start doing some things differently. So you may be thinking, wow, that's a lot. Maybe I have been biased. Don't beat yourself up. The first thing to do is learn about it, acknowledge it, then start slowing down your interactions and reactions to students. And think about how bias might be creeping in those discipline situations. It's really good to have a flow chart or a checklist to help you determine, if I'm going to refer this student for discipline or not. So Think about how bias is creeping in and how it might be impacting your work with your students and what you can do about it. Share in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you.